Okay, cool. So we are here with Dr. Irena Smith, who is a college counselor and is also the author of the Catalyst nominated book, The Golden Ticket. And this is nominated for Best Memoir. Irena, thank you for doing this interview today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the book and why you wanted to write this book?
So, Stephanie, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for the nomination, which came as a huge surprise. And I want to jump in by saying that my reaction, apart from just delight when I got the email, was I reread it and then I was like, it says first gen, and I'm absolutely not first gen. I never thought of myself as first gen because my parents had gone to college. What I didn't realize until I started thinking about it is that I was the first generation to attend school in the US.
Mhm.
And my parents, probably fortunately, didn't know that much about the college admissions process or how it worked. And also, this was pre US News and World Report rankings. So they just knew what they knew, which is that Stanford was a very good school and probably Harvard and Yale, which, they were reasonably sure I wouldn't get into because I had a 3.3
Mhm.
GPA since I was not an overachiever in high school, to their great disappointment. And the UC schools like Berkeley. And so they were, of course, bitterly disappointed that I didn't get into Berkeley. Again, 3.3 GPA. I'm not particularly surprised. And it didn't really occur to me that even though my parents were college educated, that it was always an assumption at our house that I would go to college. That we always had books. We always, I had a library card ever since forever. It didn't really occur to me that not everybody is like that until I became a teaching assistant at UCLA, and had some students in some of my sections who were first gen, what I would consider like really first gen. English was often their second language. There was no culture of college going, and they were really struggling. And one of the most gratifying things for me as a teaching assistant was working with them and helping them understand that there's a way to navigate the system, there's a way to master this kind of writing that we were asking them to do. And so part of what's weird about my work is when I became a college admissions counselor, I'm always keenly aware of the fact that, on the one hand, I work with these very successful people for the most part. Um, on the other hand, I'm always conscious of sort of where I come from and the fact that my parents would probably never pay for anybody like me. They'd just be like, do your own damn work. And they're very proud of what I do, but they had literally nothing to do with my college applications. And then because I've always tried to do pro bono work with first gen or under-resourced students, there's this incredible disconnect when I see how many resources the paid clients I'm working with have, just apart from me. And one of the very first questions I always ask them is, what is your school offering? And it's like this long list. And then they're like, well, it's not very good. And so apparently on top of like the huge resources, you also need a private college counselor, versus the first gen students I work with through Scholar Match and other avenues who are coming from a very different place.
Wow, yeah, actually, that was a question I was going to ask you is if you consider yourself a first gen, because I mean, there's obviously different experiences of first gens, but I mean, one of the things that can come into play is if your parents went to college in this country, because we have such a unique system. And I think even if you have gone to college in another country and gone all the way up, gotten your PhD, that doesn't mean you're going to know how to navigate the US college system or help your kids do that. And so there's kind of like sometimes a disconnect between the culture of college going that you have in your home, um, and then the actual knowledge of how to do the college going, the actual college part of the college going. So it's just so interesting to hear kind of like your experience with it. So tell us a little bit about the book and why you wrote it. This book is written, it's a memoir, but it's written as a series of responses to college admissions essay prompts. So tell us why you wanted to write this book and why you wanted to write it this way, outside of the fact that it's very clever. I know that you had a deeper meaning to it.
Right. Thank you. So I had been writing it a very long time. When people ask me how long it took me to write the book, my sort of off the cuff, but also serious answer is about 20 years and one weekend, which is actually true because the 20 years was just piecing together different stories and different essays about my experience as a mom, as a college counselor, as a daughter of Soviet immigrants who remembers a good part of our life there. I was 9 when we came. And I felt like for the 18 years that I've been a college admissions counselor, I've been living this very um, double-sided life where on the one hand and very publicly, I was a college admissions counselor with experience working in admissions at Stanford. And, my families that I worked with loved working with me, and it was very gratifying and successful and whatever. And then privately in my home life, which I really didn't want to disclose to anybody except people who were very close to me in my orbit, we were living through kind of constant chaos because our oldest son was diagnosed with autism when he was 2.5. My husband and I worked really intensely to help him learn how to speak, learn how to socialize. And then we had 2 more children because that just seemed like a really good idea. We wanted a big family. We thought it wouldn't be great for Jordan, our oldest, to be kind of the center of constant attention. And it turns out that living in a chaotic house with an older brother who is neurodivergent is not always a great way to grow up. And I think the 2 younger kids did gain a lot from that, but I think they also came preloaded with some of their own neurodivergent stuff. So neither of them, well, actually, I take it back. They're both potentially on the spectrum, though not as much. Like there was not a language delay, but they have learning differences. So there's a lot of stuff that they've had to struggle with. And so in my home life, I had this extremely chaotic household where our children were not being Palo Alto successful. And by that, I mean, they were not taking all the APs. They were not, prepping for SAT because we had other fish to fry at our house, like keeping people safe. And it kind of felt like it would be very off-brand of me to reveal that part of my life, even though it was a very important part of my life. And at one point, I actually said this to my therapist, who said, if I had turmoil in my life and you knew about it, would you think I was a bad therapist? And I was like, no, why would I think that? She's like, you literally just said the same thing about yourself. Like, if you have kids who are struggling, that must mean, or if then that must mean I'm a bad college counselor. So, it's obviously very stressful and lonely and difficult to pretend like everything is fine when it's not fine for many years. And I kept coming up against this like enormous disconnect between parents who were anxious and anguished about maybe their kid won't get into fill in the name of the highly rejective college, and my own anguish and anxiety, which I thought for a long time was like better. Like I have real suffering. In the suffering Olympics, I would take the gold medal and you would not even be on the podium, you foolish parents. And it took me a hot minute to realize that there's no suffering Olympics. Like their pain is just as real to them. And if you break your toe because somebody steps on it versus you're not paying attention and you walk into a sharp corner, your toe still hurts. It could be self-inflicted, it could be whatever. But their pain is just as real to them. And also this opens up probably room for another question. Many of the parents that I was working with were, of course, also they emigrated to the US from often India or China or Taiwan or other countries with a very different education system. So they, like my parents, had no idea how to help their kids.
That is so interesting. I think one of the other words that I wrote down, well, I wrote down two words like multiple times when I was reading, and one was meritocracy,
Mm.
which I'm sure we'll talk more about. And the other was about binaries. And I think, you know, we do get so stuck, whether it's our own personal reflections and feelings or, you know, discourse on like a societal level, we get stuck in these binaries. And it's all or nothing. And I think something that I loved about the book is that, you know, you did write yourself into it. And you didn't deny, you know, that you and all of us are complicit in some of the things that come back to impact us in good or bad ways. And so I felt like it was great to read something that was like, I'm just gonna write a whole book about the gray area and just be honest about it. It was so refreshing. And it wasn't about pitting sides against one another. It was just about like, this is who I am, this is my life history, this is my family history. Um, and here's how it fits in to this phase of my life that I'm in now, which is not probably what I expected when I was 18 applying to college. Um, so, with that being said, you know, you told us that your GPA was only a 3.3, which I think is still a good GPA. I am a big proponent of C's get degrees. I know that sometimes for grad school, for med school, you know, a C is not enough, but I'm also like, sometimes these students, I'm like, just survive, just get through it. Like, you just need to get to the other side. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about kind of like what you've seen, you know, your own experience applying to college where you're like, I was not the most competitive applicant, even though it sounds like still like 3.3 is pretty good. And then what you see now and who you see getting into college and how and why.
Right. So I think, I mean, the 3.3 was honestly probably a reflection of my undiagnosed ADHD. Like if you look at all of the classes I got in, the grades I got in the classes that I loved, like I probably would have graduated with a 4.7. But if you look at my science and math grades, they're a little bit more uneven. So
Mhm.
once I got to college and I got to study exactly what I wanted to study, it was like, oh, I'm killing it because I'm super interested in everything I'm learning. So, one thing that I just wanted to bookmark with that is my parents, who did not love the idea of me majoring in English, eventually were like, fine, whatever. She's writing for the student newspaper, she's getting paid. We didn't know that could be a thing. And she seems happy. So, let's just let her do that. I don't know that that would have happened in this day and age because back in the golden days when I went to UCLA, my tuition per quarter was $333, which adds up to a whopping $999 a year,
Mhm.
plus like maybe 3,000 for like living expenses, transportation, whatever else. So I don't think my parents felt like they were making this enormous investment and what was the return going to be. I have parents who frequently say, I'm not paying $80,000 a year for my kid to study, art history or something impractical. And I do try to point out that that's a choice. You actually can study art history not for $80,000 a year. You can go to community college, then transfer to a UC, or you could put schools on your list that would be delighted to give your brilliant, talented child a scholarship, sometimes a full scholarship. And so I think what has shifted is between the US News and World Report starting to rank colleges in the early 80s, which really, I think, did a number on the American public because we like our lists and our rankings and our hierarchies. And so who wants to go to school number 37, when you can apply to school number one or number two? And that went hand in hand with the increasingly aggressive defunding of public education so that it stopped being a public good and became a private luxury, because right now UC fees for in-state students add up to something like 46,000, which is ridiculous because I'm not that old. Like I'm not young, but it's not like I went to college in the 1800s. So Sometimes it feels that way. So it's ridiculous that that happened. And I think because of that, the stakes feel higher. Like you better get into a school that's going to make it worthwhile for us to pay
Mhm.
this amount of money, which I personally think is logically problematic reasoning because you could save a lot of money by sending your kid to a Cal State or a UC or any number of other excellent state schools or community college. But that is so stigmatized in Palo Alto, where I live and work, that I've literally had people be like, audible gasp, did you just say community college? And I'm like, yes, sorry.
Oh my gosh. Well, that, everything you're talking about brought to mind for me, um, some of the things that happened when Reagan,
Yeah.
was governor of California. And, I think it's a pattern that we see now, to this day where college is talked about as something that prepares you for the workforce. And I always think about that, and it's kind of a dilemma in my own mind because I do work with a lot of first gen college students, and the reality is they are there to get a return on their investment. And it's kind of funny to hear, more affluent families saying the same thing actually. But with these first gens, I'm like, yeah, of course you want to build some skills and something that prepares you for the future, but at the same time, it just feels so transactional. And you're kind of missing out on the intellectual fun of college potentially.
Yeah.
And it's just something that I wonder about where it seems like whether you are a first gen college student, um, from like a lower income community or whether your parents are affluent and doctors and lawyers and whatever themselves, every parent is like, well, I don't want to waste my money on some dumb degree like arts or whatever. And I'm like, when did the arts become dumb? We all have Netflix. Like somebody has to make it.
Right,
Um,
somebody has to make it. This is so funny to me because back, like, I can't even remember how many years ago, I was obsessively watching Mad Men, and there was a woman being interviewed on NPR whose sole job, I mean, she had other jobs and she was not working on Mad Men, but her job was to work with a $50,000 a week budget to source mid-century modern furniture and accessories at antique shops. And I was like, how do you get that job? Like, what did she study in college? I'm guessing she probably studied art history or American studies, or something very niche that everybody was like, why are you doing that? Until it came time to get hired for Mad Men, because who's going to know that stuff like somebody who actually studied the era? Or, for example, a useless quote unquote history major can end up getting hired as a consultant on a show about, I don't know, Game of Thrones, because even though it's fictional, somebody who's a medieval historian and who understands how that world works and is organized is going to need to be on board to make it believable. So there are definitely jobs. I don't think they're as publicized. Like there's not a, here's your track to making money. But there's also transferable skills, which I keep explaining to students and parents, where if you can write well, if you can communicate well, if you can think critically, you will not be out of a job. Whereas if you if you major in something marketable, um, that you don't like or that you're not good at, you're going to get eaten alive by people who are just as passionate about that as you are about art history. Like I would have been a horrible engineer. My parents had their way.
yeah, it's interesting because I think so many young people, especially those that come from immigrant families, especially from certain parts of the world, there is an expectation. Like, these are your choices. And, a lot of people will say, well, don't listen to your parents, do what you want to do. And it's really not that simple. And, there are many, many, many students who are willing to kind of give up on their own dreams to make their parents happy. And it's not because they're weak or pathetic or just being controlled. It's because there's a lot of complicated cultural dynamics at play that people don't realize. But I think one of the things that pushes this narrative that there's only like three worthwhile careers um, is this idea that we have this shift that we had about college being like this factory that produces workers. And some of those workers are like the top tier workers. Some of us are just teachers, like, we're the losers down here that only want to educate, the future of America. And it's not about like anything moral, it's or your mission or your passion. It's just about like what will make you the most money, and what you have to study the most years to do, which I always think is so funny, because it's not just about the money. You could make much more money doing other things and you could study less.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I don't want to get all political about it, but I think that, what we're seeing, this monetization of college and often high school, is essentially late stage capitalism, where it's like being divorced from ethics, from morality, from the recognition that somebody might have a higher purpose than making money. And it's really all about the bottom line. It's, what is this worth? And one of my um, really interesting moments of revelation in stepping away from college counseling and into writing is it's a very clear object lesson about what is valued monetarily and what is not, because it's a very rare person who actually makes money from writing, but college counseling, you rake in the money.
yeah, I think the book that LT and our friend Georgina and I put together, we edited together. I think we get a check, like our first check was like $60. And I think like the next year we got 20, and like we haven't even gotten back, forget about the time we put into it. If you threw an hourly rate on that, we haven't even gotten back like what we paid uh uh, the person who indexed our book. Like we don't plan to, because it's a passion project and something that we wanted to invest in. But yeah, I think people don't realize that you don't they make a lot of money writing, and that's because there's not this like exchange, and it's not as tangible. What you get when you read a book, I mean, I would argue it's more valuable, but
Absolutely.
I want to go back to what you were talking about quickly about different jobs that we just don't even know about. So something I tell people is that when I was getting ready to go to college, I only knew like the Fisher Price careers. I knew you could be like a doctor, a teacher, a policeman, a fireman, and like a ballerina or something. Like I just had no concept. And people would talk a lot about, oh, I don't want a job where I just sit in a cubicle all day. And I always had this question in my mind that I was never brave enough to ask, but I was thinking like, but what are they doing in the cubicle?
Exactly. What's
Like,
going on?
what's the job? Yeah, like I just never understood what the job was. And one of the ways that I have learned about jobs is through popular media, which is kind of what the Catalyst Awards, I think, is the premise for it, is that popular media, whether it's a memoir, a TV show, a podcast, is accessible to people. And I remember having a friend in grad school who had majored in art history, and she had worked, I think, at Sotheby's or like some auction house for like a year after college. And I remember being like, well, I don't understand what that has to do with art history, because of course, like I didn't know what an auction house was really. um and I remember watching an episode of 30 Rock where one of the characters goes to like Sotheby's or something, and he's interacting with this woman who's like, telling him about the art and these collections that they've gotten in and this and that. And there are similar things even in like some of the Star Wars series that are on Disney Plus now, where they're like, there's kind of this like gallery that's a cover for some of the like little secret activities they're doing, and they're talking about all this stuff. I think like after seeing those two, I was like, so that's the job. Like they know about it. They can authenticate it. They can tell you like what its value and why it's important. Um, and so I guess like, you know, for related to like this conversation and to the book, what does your family think of this career that you have now? Because it's probably not something that they were promoting to you, and it's probably not something you saw on TV necessarily. when you were growing up. But what do you and like what do your parents and your family, even if you have family back in Russia, like what do they think of this?
So we don't, most of our immediate family is here. So the family back in Russia is, very distant, like third and fourth cousins. I will say, in my parents' defense, after doing their best to encourage me to become an engineer, I think they finally gave up on that. And what was interesting to me is how supportive they became after that, but also how much of an education it was for them to see that if you were doing something you loved and you were good at, opportunities sort of found you. And like one of the still to me mind blowing things is I started writing for the Daily Bruin at UCLA. Because I had a roommate who was into journalism and she dragged me to orientation, and that's what I ended up doing pretty exhaustively and extensively for 3 years. But my first quote unquote real job literally fell into my lap because of the Daily Bruin, because my beat was science and education. So I covered several events at the Graduate School of Education, and their development and fundraising person was like, we need actually somebody like who does PR and writes press releases. And I'm going to take this girl out to lunch. I only found this out later because I was like, why am I going out to lunch with this woman? Am I in trouble? I was like a senior or junior in college. She took me out to this really nice lunch in Westwood and was like, we would like you to come and work for us. And I was like, me, really? And she was like, yes, we really love your writing. And so all of a sudden, I had my own office in the Graduate School of Education at UCLA, and I was interviewing really interesting professors who were doing fascinating work and getting like op-ed pieces in the LA Times. And it was a really cool job that literally I did not apply for. I did not know about. Well, I guess I knew about it because as somebody who worked on the Daily Morning, I could have potentially gone and become a journalist from there. I could have stayed in PR. My husband periodically is like, if you did, and we moved to the Bay Area, you could have been like Google's employee 52 PR person. And I'm like, no, that ship has sailed. I would rather go to graduate school and study comparative literature because it's noble. So I think that if you are good at what you do, you will figure out a way to make it work. And so my family has been really supportive pretty much during every turn. Like they were supportive of the PR thing, they were supportive of grad school. They were super proud when I finished my dissertation. I taught for about 10 years and then I pivoted to college admissions. And if anything, this was interesting to me because it is such a consuming job. And I think on the one hand, they were really proud that I was like well compensated. And on the other hand, they kept complaining that I was busy all the time and I was constantly answering email and talking to people on the phone. And they were like, come hang out with us in San Francisco. And I was like, no, I can't. It's the middle of early action deadlines. And so they've been great. And I think most parents, honestly, if they can see their kid being happy and successful, I think would be like, yeah, okay, I'm on board.
That is so funny. It's such an immigrant parent paradox. It's like they want you to eat more but be skinny. They want you to make a lot of money but be free like 24 hours a day. And I don't know, maybe it's a parent paradox, but I think it's just like a special little nuance that it takes when it's immigrant parents, parents that grow up elsewhere. Um, thank you for sharing that. It's so interesting to, I think, just get to know the person behind the book and kind of like what your journey was that led you there. I think, something I encounter with college students, and I think it's also a narrative we see a lot in popular media is like, I need to declare my major and that's going to determine what I do with my life. And I'm like, no, it's not. I mean, yeah, maybe if you like study engineering and then you go to grad school for engineering, you're kind of like locked into engineering, but you can still change down the road. For me, I mean, I have a teaching certificate that I don't use anymore, but it just, the path led me here. And this is like my third different type of career that I've had. And now, I'm doing the Catalyst Awards with LT, which is a passion project, but it's like, I never thought that I would be sitting here on Zoom interviewing people about the interesting things they're doing. And so, yeah, I think, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about the whole college admissions process is what you see, or if you see anything, if you know what becomes of your students that you work with after they're accepted, and do, you know, obviously don't want to invade anyone's privacy, but do you see, you know, students achieving like this path that, you know, they and their parents envision for themselves, or do you see them kind of taking some twists and turns?
I think I see both. And one of the things to your point about students feeling like they need to declare a major and they need to set a course for their life, I call that the professionalization of childhood. There's a new book by Jennifer Wallace called Never Enough, where she uses the same term, where it's like you not only have to know what you're going to major in as a 16 or 17-year-old, but you have to demonstrate preparation for the major. And I'm like, seriously, because when I was in high school, I had absolutely no idea what I want. I knew that I didn't want to be an engineer, and that was my pretty much only point of certainty. And so I think to put kids in a place where they're still growing, they're still learning about themselves, to know what they're going to major in and to have this path. Sometimes it works out. And I've had students where they were like, this is what I'm going to do. And, sure enough, I'm like, oh, look at you, 4 years later, absolutely living the dream. And sometimes when the path is so set and life throws curveballs at you, which in some cases has been the school is not the right fit. Like they did everything they possibly could to get into the stretch school. And now all of a sudden they have gone from being in the top 10% of their high school to being in a college where everybody was in the top 10% of their high school. So mathematically, somebody now has to be in the bottom 50%. And if they set the goal for themselves, I have to go to medical school, and suddenly they don't have a 4.0 GPA and they become stressed and they feel stupid and inadequate, like it just cascades. So I really try to impress that on students that, if they want to go to graduate school, go to a school where you could be a rock star and feel good about yourself. And honestly, I feel like that's what a school should feel like. That's what applying to a school should feel like. It should not feel like an abusive relationship. Like if somebody is stressed and unhappy, literally, I was like, if you are constantly feeling like you're not good enough,
Mhm.
maybe you should fall out of love with that college and in love with a different college, right? That's going to make you feel good about yourself. It's a weird analogy, but
It's not, it's so funny that you said that because when I used to work at UCLA, and I worked really mostly with first gen college students, and you know, many of them had they were from the Central Valley. They had parents that, like, while they're at UCLA in like a biochemistry class, their parents are out like picking almonds or something. So it's just this huge transition when they're home and at school. And they characterized it the same way. They were like, UCLA, and no shade to UCLA in particular, because I'm sure like there are many elite schools where students feel like this, but you know, they were like, I feel like UCLA is like this terrible boyfriend, but I can't leave him. And it's like you see the light at the end of the tunnel, so you're like, I can endure just a little bit more. And you know, it's almost like what came with that was just this gaslighting of them feeling like it was their fault if they, you know, weren't good enough and didn't have the GPA that their classmates had. And you know, something that they shared a lot actually is just the fact that like they didn't go to a college prep type of high school, and so they didn't take trigonometry when they were in 11th grade. And you see all these students who get to UCLA, and then they're in, you know, the so-called remedial classes, which a lot of times they love because they're around other kids from like their neighborhood and stuff. And it's more relatable actually. And it's more attuned to like just laying a foundation for them. Um, uh, but then, you know, when once they advance, especially in STEM, to like these weeder classes that are intentionally just hard for no reason, just to weed people out, you know, they're on academic probation. So I'm like, you stretched, and it's like such an amazing accomplishment and you want to finish. But I'm always like, then what happens next? Like once you're there, and is it really the best thing for you even mentally? Um, you know, what becomes of them? And I wish more people kind of thought about it that way, as an experience instead of as an achievement. Like it is an achievement, but I
Well,
think
the
that should
achievement
happen.
of getting in, I kind of feel like is very different than, okay, then what are you going to do for 4 years? You know, it's like, okay, you got in, but then what are you going to do with that? Are you going to feel terrible about yourself and like you don't belong there? Are you going to thrive? Are you going to find your people? Are you going to constantly be feeling shame because your under-resourced high school didn't prepare you for the classes that you're needing to take? And then if they are pre-med, like, how's that going to work for medical school, right?
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of the half the conversations I had when I was there is these aspiring doctors um that were kind of slowly realizing like I'm not going to be able to go to med school with the GPA I have even if I do pass the classes. Um so I think like maybe related to that, can we talk a little bit about my other big all caps word that I wrote a million times when I was reading your book, which was
Yeah.
meritocracy. Um I know that that's kind of something you play with in the book, even like for yourself, for your parenting, for like your own kind of life journey is what does success mean?
Yeah.
Um, and and who is able to access different types of success?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's such a great question because I think that we like to tell ourselves stories about meritocracy to make ourselves feel good as a society, right? And the whole Horatio Alger, up by the bootstrap story.
Mhm.
It took me a very long time to realize that um, there is such a thing as invisible privilege. My parents, who are lovely people, will occasionally, trot out the we came here with nothing and we worked really hard and we did well. And not to take away from them, they absolutely did. They came here with, four suitcases and no money and worked really, really hard. What I think they also came with that, just conveniently goes unacknowledged, not because they're villains, but because when you're living a life that's easier because of privilege, I think it's invisible to you. But they came with their white skin. They came with their college education, even if it was in a different country. They came because we were helped by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which helped Soviet Jews transition from the Soviet Union to the US. And just quick shout out, continues to work with refugees across the world, which is really amazing. And they don't have to be Jewish. But this idea that meritocracy doesn't apply equally. Somebody who is going to illegally cross the border is not going to have the entry points with no college education and no possessions, and no documents that my parents had. And one of the things I think about a lot, particularly given our immigration crisis, is that when we left the Soviet Union, we lost our citizenship. That was part of the fun of emigrating, as you were considered an enemy of the people and you were stripped of your citizenship, which means that you were stateless, or as we like to call people in this country, undocumented. And you couldn't go straight to the US until your application for asylum was approved. And so Soviet Jews were funneled first to Austria and then to Italy. And I just thought to ask my mom during like the horrible stuff that was happening at the border in 2018. And I was like, how did we live in Austria and Italy? Like, did we have paperwork? And she was like, no, we were undocumented. And they just had this like silent agreement that, as long as you didn't commit a crime or try to get full-time work, you could just quietly live there until you were admitted into the US. We don't afford luxuries like that to brown people. And so, white people who emigrated from Europe and who are like, well, we waited our turn, waited their turn in very different circumstances and with a very different context. So I think the whole idea of a meritocracy that, anybody by dint of their hard work can rise to the top is just not true. I mean, our society is built on a long history of genocide and racial oppression and other things that I'm sure you and our listeners will know, and to pretend that it isn't, and to pretend that anybody, including people to whom literacy was denied less than 300 years ago, are just gonna like up and soar to the top is
Mhm.
not true. So I have a lot of issues with the idea of a meritocracy because it seems to be leveled up a lot by how much money you have. Like suddenly people who are not particularly deserving but have a lot of money get, bumped to the top. And then the whole idea of success, I think, is an even more complicated thing because, okay, if meritocracy gets you to the top, like the top of what? Are you the richest person? Are you the most influential? Um, or, are you living, I guess this sounds a little woo-woo, but are you living your best life? Are you living a life that feels intentional and authentic and, you're doing things that you look forward to getting up and doing the next day? Which I think right now all three of my kids are. It's not the conventional Palo Alto way, but two of the three of them have their own health insurance, which
Right. In 2024, look, that they're living the dream right now.
right. So, I think it took me a long time to get to that point because everybody moves to Palo Alto because the schools are good, and the schools are good because they'll get you into a good college, and a good college will get you, money and a Tesla, and, but then what?
Well, how much of that do you think is parents comparing themselves to other parents? I know they want the best for their kids, but um it seems like the happiness part of the equation kind of goes out the window. And I always wonder, like, how much of this is you saying that you want the best for your kid, but you're actually just trying to like outdo the other moms and dads and parents out there?
I think there's a lot of that. And I think honestly, it's not unique to college. I think it becomes more toxic in conjunction with college. But for example, I was in a mom and baby group with my oldest son. All the mommies are sitting there going, my kid's already walking. My kid's picking up Cheerios with a pincer grasp. I mean, or not saying it, but like constantly like, oh crap, like my kid's not walking yet. What's wrong with them? Right. Except the difference is if your kid is not walking and they're 13 months old, you're not going to run out and buy them a walking tutor. But when your kid is not doing whatever in, eighth grade, then yeah, you're going to spring for a math tutor to get them to jump ahead in geometry or whatever they need to skip. So I think there is a lot of that. I think it's human nature, but I think that I can't remember who said comparison is the thief of joy. But it really is. Like there are now scientific studies that show that people feel crappy when they go to social media and look at everybody else's happy lives.
Yeah, that's why I don't really go on social media anymore outside of the First Gen and Juice account because the First Gen and Juice account is a happy place. We're all cheering each other on, but yeah, it can be toxic, I guess. I think like in that vein, what advice would you give to first gen college students who are trying to go to college, perhaps an elite college, and thrive there? I think a lot of them are surviving. Um, and we see that the, retention and graduation rates at some of these elite colleges are almost comparable, between first gens and the general student population, perhaps like a couple percentage points lower. And the UC system, a lot of these schools like to brag about that and say, like, look, we're supporting our first gens. And I'm like, no, you just have this reputation where like they feel like they can't drop out, but you didn't do anything. Like they just killed themselves. They stayed with their toxic boyfriend for a little bit longer. So I guess based on everything that you've seen, working at Stanford in the private sector, what advice do you have for those students who do want to go to Stanford or, one of these elite colleges?
I think my first piece of advice would be to really examine why and what the goal is. Because wanting to go to Stanford, I mean, far be it from me to judge people, but that's not a great goal. It's like sort of similar to, I like my goal is that Jeremy Allen White noticed me on social media and we go out for coffee.
That's a
That's
great
great.
goal.
Right, it's a great goal, and you could do a lot like by, I don't know, putting on a lot of makeup and cultivating a rich social media presence and, investing in good lighting. But like, what if that doesn't happen? And what if you build yourself up and are like, I'm going to do everything I possibly can, and then it doesn't happen because why would it, right? It's not, the odds are not quite as astronomical of not getting into Stanford, but I would consider, honestly, why? What does Stanford have that, over 2,000 other colleges and universities don't have? Like, is the goal to study this thing? Is the goal to have this experience? Or is the goal to be able to say you went to Stanford? So I would sort of ask that, like, what is the goal? And I would also think about, okay, say you are at Stanford, what happens then? What support are you going to get? Is this tenable for you or your family financially? Are you going to feel good about yourself or not good about yourself at the school? Are there first gen students there that you can talk to? And I think that there's been so much mythologizing about Stanford and its peer schools that I think people are sort of dazzled and they're like, well, everybody knows it's a good school and it's a self-perpetuating cycle. But there are lots of other schools that would be delighted to have the student without them feeling like they have to kill themselves before they even get there.
Yeah, you're making me think about Rory from Gilmore Girls, and her whole like I feel like her whole personality was I want to go to Yale, and I read.
Yeah.
And I was like, there's got to be like more to you, like why Yale? Or no, not Yale, it was Harvard, I think. Then she ended up going to Yale, but it was like always about Harvard. Um, and it was like, but why Harvard? Like, why Harvard? Why not Yale? Why not Princeton? Like, even among the Ivies, it was like, why this school? And we never really got an answer. I don't think, I don't know, it's been like 20 years since I've watched that show, but so I might be forgetting. But I think like a lot of our media does push this narrative, whether it's, fictional, or whether it's like these human interest stories of students. I mean, I feel like the media loves a story of like Miguel is from the wrong side of the tracks and now he's the president of, the junior class at Harvard. And it's like that's the only kind of first gen that we're willing to celebrate. Um, and so I feel like, we do kind of push this idea that like if you're a first gen, um, you have to do 100 times as good as it's not good enough to just go to Harvard. You need to be the president of your class. You need to be the editor of the law journal. um and then where does that leave like the rest of our students? And there are a lot of first gens in the US, a lot of, especially if we include students whose parents attended college but never finished, or students, whose parents have a technical degree or certificate, but not like a 4-year bachelor's degree. And so where does that leave the rest of them? You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, feeling, presumably feeling inadequate because only one person can be the junior class president or the editor of the law review. You're actually making me think too of a more recent example, Never Have I Ever, where Davy's whole thing is she has to get into Princeton. Like she must get into Princeton. That is the most important thing. And I actually wrote about this a little bit ago. Do you know why she's so fixated with Princeton? Okay, so I went back and watched, and she has a splashback in the last season where she's talking to her dad, and she's like teeny tiny, I think, just going to first grade. And her dad is like, "So, Davy, first day of first grade," and she's like, "Mm-hmm," and she's like eating her cereal, and the dad is all. You thought about where you want to go to college? And I'm like, well, that's a splendid question for a first grader. And so she's like, got her mouth full of Cheerios, and she's like, I'm gonna go to Princess College because of course she does. And the dad is like, oh, honey, there's no Princess College, but there is Princeton College. It's a really good school. And she goes, okay, I'll go there. And he goes, good. I'm glad we have that figured out. And then he goes and dies. And then it becomes this thing that she has to do literally because, like, it's practically his dying wish, right? And I'm like, I'm sorry, who tells a first grader that there's no Princess College? First of all, I think there should be. And second of all, that's what you're going to substitute it with. Not like, what would you want to study? Like nothing, just there's this.
Yeah. I mean, I think we see it I'm thinking also of like in The Heights, where one of the characters, Nina, goes to Stanford, and The Sex Lives of College Girls, which is set
Yes.
at basically at an Ivy that's, not an Ivy.
Mhm.
And, one of the things that comes up with a lot of these schools where the dream is like to make it to that school that's supposed to be like above, wherever you are now somehow, is this concept of like paying for it and how much you're willing to give,
Right.
not just like emotionally, intellectually, but also financially. And, both of those characters run into situations, no spoilers, although this stuff is a couple years old now, so y'all should have watched it by now, but no spoilers. Both of those characters, Kimberly and Nina, run into situations where they have to make a decision about whether they should stay at that school,
Exactly.
um, without a scholarship.
Yeah.
Um, and, you
And
know,
Kimberly is constantly like, it's not just college. It's
Mhm.
like, the other three roommates who don't really have to think about money are like, hey, let's go, out to eat. And she's like, nope, can't. Or, let's do this, also can't. And that has to be so hard for students who are not used to
Mhm.
living like money doesn't matter because she's there on scholarship. She, I'm sure, has to parcel out every single penny that she has. And yeah, I found that heartbreaking.
Yeah, there's another show on Netflix called Young Royals, and there's a main storyline about like the Prince of Denmark or something, one of those countries, Sweden, and he has a little romance going on with, one of the working class boys in town, and that character has a sister who's decided she wants to move into the dorms at this boarding school, even though they live in the town, and she somehow gets a scholarship, I think, to be able to do that. And like you see her not being able to do things like go for coffee with them. And every morning they get their little coffee and their pastry, and she's over there sweating like, oh my God, I could barely pay for one coffee. And like, now I don't have any money left. Now
Yeah,
what?
right,
I think that's
right.
something that Rory, like in Gilmore Girls, didn't really deal with because she had like those grandparents. And a lot of people are like, that's why I don't consider her a first gen.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and it's, I think that the college going culture was there even though her mom dropped out. I think that there was no lack of sort of
Mhm.
intellectual like just resources in that family. I'm sure the grandparents, I didn't watch all the seasons, but I'm sure the grandparents had a lovely library. I'm sure that she was taken to cultural events. I'm sure that she was immersed through them. And yeah, she's not so much first gen.
Very interesting because her mom, like you said, didn't go to college, and the grandparents weren't always really in her life. And there are episodes where you can tell the mom like has no idea what's going on with some of the college stuff. Um, and then the grandparents come in and it's the total opposite. It's like the mom can't really help her at all sometimes, even though she's doing her best. And the grandparents make it so she doesn't have to do anything and it'll just fall in her lap. And I'm like, neither of these things are like ideal, really. Like, and another spoiler alert, but again, this is like 20 years old. Sorry, y'all. But she ends up dropping out of where did she go? Of Yale. Um, and that's like a very controversial season. A lot of people are like, she spent her whole life dreaming of college, and how could she drop out? It's like inconsistent with the character. And I'm like, not really, because like the dream was like a childhood dream. It wasn't like she didn't even know why she was dreaming about that. And so there's like this shock that kind of hits them when like reality
Right.
is different from what they imagined.
And you can also have a different dream than going to a very specific college, especially if that specific college has an admit rate that is staggeringly low.
Hmm. Whew. Okay, Irina, you're so
Wow.
like have so many nuggets. I'm like, what do I want to ask you about next? I think one thing that I wanted to talk about is kind of the other side of you writing this book and writing this series of essays and actually finding a publisher for it. I know we have a lot of followers at First Gen and Juice that want to publish or want to start a podcast or whatever, and they're just kind of like, I don't even know where to start. So yeah, tell us a little bit about your experience with that.
So my experience with that was, I think a good word to describe it would be nonlinear, in that I was ultimately very lucky, but it took a lot of zigzags to get there. So I finally got the bits and pieces I'd been writing into some kind of shape in the middle of the year in 2020 because we were all sheltering in place, and what else was I going to do? And I got very lucky and found an agent who loved the manuscript. That was why it took me the weekend plus 20 years, because I said I completed the manuscript when technically I really had not. And so she asked me to send it to her. And it was Friday. And I was like, can I just put some finishing touches on it and send it to you on Monday? And she was like, sure. And then I spent 72 hours like nonstop actually finishing
It's
the
an
manuscript.
ADHD queen story. I can
Right?
just,
I have a consequential deadline. Let me do this thing.
this is my
Anyway,
process too.
exactly. She loved it. She was very excited about it. She said it fell into the category of memoir plus because it was not just my life, it was also about very relevant contemporary issues like college admissions, varsity blues. And then we went on submission, which means it gets pitched to various publishing houses. And in the process, we accrued 70 plus rejections, 70, because it turns out the publishing industry is very conservative. And by conservative, I don't mean politically, but I mean they're very risk averse. So they're just like, we're not putting our money into somebody who has like, 200 friends on Facebook, and, we don't know who this woman is or why people should care. And my favorite was they were like, and we don't know how to sell this book. And I'm like, oh my God, I know how to sell this book, like to every parent of high school students who is angsting about what's going to happen with their kid. So after that cascading series of bitter disappointments, I found a hybrid press called She Writes Press, which is shout out to them, and incredible undertaking helmed by Brooke Warner, who essentially has created this amazing platform for women authors who are otherwise getting shut out of the publishing world. And essentially, the only difference between that and traditional publishing is you front the publishing costs, and then you also retain complete creative control, and you get about 60 to 70% of your royalties, as opposed to a publishing house traditionally, where I don't think you get a whole lot. And that was a really incredible experience. And I um, fell into this amazing community of women, because one of their like really cool things is that they really cultivate the solidarity and support among all the writers who published with them. So I signed with them in 2021. The book came out in 2023. It's definitely been a journey. There are more hybrid publishers out there. So I think, the big obstacle for most people is I don't have several $1,000s to pay for publishing costs. Um, I am pretty sure that She Writes Press has a prize, and I cannot remember what it's called, but if you go on their website, I think it explains it, particularly for writers of color. So if there are, first gen writers of color who are obviously underrepresented in publishing, I think there is financial assistance. And so that would be, for people who feel like they have a book in them, that to me bypasses a lot of the gatekeeping, but of course there's the financial gatekeeping. The other thing that I recently discovered that I absolutely love is Substack. And while it's not professional publishing, it is publishing. They make it ridiculously easy to, create and publish content. And there are people who are making quite a bit of money on Substack by just, paywalling their stuff. And it's a really interesting, really thoughtful community of people who are, for the most part, writers, but there are also, people who are interested in technology and travel, in food, in the college experience, in all kinds of things. Like Roxane Gay has a huge Substack. There's a bunch of really good stuff on there. So, and it kind of, I feel like democratized publishing in that, you know, if you want to have your stuff out there for free, you can. If you want to have your stuff out there and have a possibility that people support your work, you can. Maybe you can use your Substack proceeds to publish a book with a hybrid publisher. So that would be my advice, is not to go through, and again, I say this as a person who didn't have a great experience with traditional publishing, but it turns out traditional publishing is also not a meritocracy. I feel like there, it's not, you know, may the book, best book win. Um, and no, although I was gonna say no shade, but maybe yes shade, like there's probably a reason that Kellyanne Conway, you know, gets like $1 million advance. I don't know that her book was a work of literary genius, right? But that's like who gets published easily and quickly. And I cannot imagine how many truly talented authors with something to say there are right now out there who are not given a platform and not given a voice.
So true. I feel like I have a million essays inside of me that I'm like, when I finish my dissertation, I'm gonna put them somewhere. And sometimes I text my ideas to LT. I'm like, just remember that I told you about this idea because ADHD, I will forget it in like 30 minutes.
Oops.
But it'll be somewhere in this text thread.
Mhm.
And I think more people, you know, do need to take advantage of that. I think we're seeing it somewhat. There's a lot of podcasts now, but I think people forget that like you can just have your blog, your website, your Substack, and just it doesn't, not everything has to be an entire book.
Yep,
Sometimes you just watch an episode of Gilmore Girls and you have something to say about it. Um,
exactly.
Sometimes you have a conversation with an author and you start thinking about what is a first gen really and what's the definition, and is the definition I had before still the definition I have now, which are
Mhm.
things I'm thinking of.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
I wanted to ask you one more question, which is if I am giving this book to a first gen, either future first gen college student, current first gen college student, grad student, first gen professional, whatever, someone, you know, with that experience, is there a chapter that you think they should start with?
That is a great question. I would say one of two, either the very last chapter, which is my open letter to high school seniors, guessing about which literary characters who have experienced adversity would get into college and why. Or probably the other one being my experience watching American television and learning English while my parents were hard at work,
Mhm,
working on their version of the American dream, because I think it really captures the disconnect
mhm,
between what parents hope for their kids when they upend everything and move to a new country, and the route that the kids choose, which is not necessarily going to be the route. But it, I mean, looking back on it, and then also talking to my mom, who was like, you don't know how guilty I felt that we were leaving you. We didn't have a choice. And I was like, I was living the dream. I was eating Kellogg's Corn Pops and watching Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch. Like, please do not apologize. The only thing I'm still mad about is you tried to make me not watch TV, but being left alone to do that, like, I was living my best life.
yes, that chapter I think is was so funny. I don't know, just like you and your parents kind of in this cat and mouse game over the TV.
Yep.
Um, and you know, TV gets a bad rap, but I'm like, but it's narratives, it's stories, and it gives you a peek into other lives the same way that books do. I know it's like
Mhm.
a different way of interacting with it. When I was a kid, like I would, yeah, of course, I would watch TV, and I also read. I had a copy of like a kid's version of a Bible, which we're not religious. Um, and I remember my parents just being like, I don't like any of this, you know, like like what's going on over here? And now, you know, both of those things are kind of like in what I do with the Catalyst Awards, even what I do in my dissertation. I have a whole thing about parables and rebirth and Easter experiences. And I'm like, I wasn't reading the Bible when I was 8 because I even knew what Jesus was. I
Right.
just loved like the story
Right.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
that's something we need to I think, let people do a little more is like stop and appreciate the stories in your everyday life, which I think is like what you do so well in this book is kind of take the everyday and just ask us to look a little closer at it. Um, and it's just like an awesome book. Everyone go read it.
Thank
I
you.
loved it. I will say, and this is not a bad thing, but it's an easy read. It just feels like reading. It feels like talking to a friend, kind of. It's not a book where you're like, all right, I gotta like pull out my dictionary, like figure out what's going on here.
Oh,
Especially as someone with ADHD, I was like, I'm not doing the thing where I read the same paragraph 15 times and keep realizing that I was not paying attention to what I was reading. Like I actually was very immersed in it. And is there another book coming next?
there is another book coming out next at some point. I love to the one ADHD mind to another because I write the way I think, and you were like, yes, I could do this. I'm working on a second book right now, which is also a collection of personal essays, but this one about sort of travel and exile and displacement. So we'll see what happens with that.
I love it. All right. Well, any final words about the golden ticket, or anything else about first gens that you want to share?
Um, I think other than a huge thank you for an amazing conversation. I just realized we've been talking for like an hour and a half and it feels like 5 minutes. Um, but I think that, it obviously it's called the golden ticket, ironically, just to beware of gold things. And I say this to both first gen students and their parents, because we were just talking about stories. In stories, things that are gold are often dangerous or at least double sided. The golden fleece, the golden apple of discord, the golden ticket is not so great for 4 of the 5 kids who get into the chocolate factory. If you think about it, it's only really good for Charlie, right? It's not at all great for the other 4. And so I think I would just be a little more open to the idea of, if something looks like the golden ticket, or if you're thinking of something in terms of the golden ticket, maybe think deeper.
Look a little more closely.
Mhm.
I love that advice. I think, before we started recording, I was sharing a little bit about how I went to a state school for my undergrad and then an Ivy for grad school. And um, it is not what it seems.
Mhm.
They're selling this image to you. And the actual experience there is what matters. I mean, at this point, nobody cares that I went to Columbia for grad school. Like, it's not getting me a job. It's not getting me anything except like a couple oohs and ahs when I share it for the first time.
But it's
And so
yeah.
what's that?
Oh, I was just gonna say it's what you do there. It's not really,
Mhm.
it's not the
Yeah,
school, it's you at the school.
those are like amazing final words. I want any first gens that are watching this, future first gens, like parents of first gens, just let it sink in. They don't need to go to Stanford, Harvard, Yale, or whatever to be a successful first gen. Uh,
Exactly.
so with that, Irina, thank you so much for this conversation.
Stephanie,
Um,
thank you. This was great.
uh, y'all go read the book, The Golden Ticket. I'm sure it's everywhere that you can find any book. It's 2024. We all know how to find our books. You can also go to irenasmith.com. And I think the Instagram is at Irena Smith Writes.
It's Irene. No, I think it's at Irena.Smith.
Okay. Well, go to irenasmith.com and then you'll find her Instagram on there. And I'm sure we'll put it in the little description on the video along with like some of the some of the other things that we talked about today. So thank you so much, Irena.
Thank you. Take care.